Welcome to this episode of Inside Legal ESG. My name is Pam Cohn, and I am honored to be the host for this podcast series. Our guest today is Mark Henriques, partner at the law firm of Womble, Dickenson. He's based in Charlotte, North Carolina. Welcome, Mark. We're so happy to have you with us today.
Pam, I'm thrilled to be with you and excited to talk with you about ESG issues, and Happy New Year to you.
Likewise, we're excited to have you. So let's start by having you describe for us what your practice is at Womble, Dickenson, and how did you get involved in the ESG space?
Great. So I've been at Womble for 32 years. We're one of those that I call myself a lifer. I've never practiced at another law firm. It's been a great experience. I've been in our business litigation team that whole time, but my practice has really evolved over the years. So when electronic discovery was really popular back in the days when emails were innovative, I got very involved in that. After that passed, I'm on our innovation board, so I've looked at some cutting issues. And several years ago, it became clear to us in kind of a working group in our litigation team that ESG was really going to be a pretty pivotal and critical area. So we've got a team at Womble that includes both litigators and transactional attorneys that address ESG issues. My perspective as a litigator is primarily in litigation itself, handling companies that get charged with any type of ESG claim. It could be a claim for greenwashing. It could be a claim for climate change. It could be a securities violation claim saying that they've misstated something in one of their public reports. All of those are things that I would do. My focus is particularly on class action defense, and we see quite a bit of class actions arising in the ESG area. I also do some litigation prevention, and we can talk about some of those tips on this podcast, but trying to help companies figure out where the risky spots are, what the trends are in litigation, and kind of guide companies through that process. And then we've got a team of transactional lawyers too that help more detailed crafting of ESG plans, looking at what standards to use, how to implement them, often working with other professionals to help folks in companies really develop a full ESG playbook.
And thus reducing their future risk, right?
Yes,
Doing it right in the
it's all about
place.
risk reduction. I do think from most of the clients we're working with, risk reduction is probably the number one priority. I do think there are certainly other priorities around ESG. I mean, there is often a corporate culture and a cultural commitment around many of the ESG values, both some of the climate and environmental things, but also the social impetus. So that is often a key component of a company's culture, their mission statement, their values. And there are other stakeholders, consumers, stockholders, other people who have expressed interest and are putting increased pressure on companies to think about issues beyond profits. And that's one way, a lot of these ESG issues, although sometimes they can add to the bottom line, they're often looking at what the company is doing beyond it. So I think, so those are all factors, but certainly as a litigator, my main pitch is let's reduce your risk. You don't want to get sued for something you did, or even worse, something that you said you were doing and didn't. That's where I see a lot of the claims. Companies get excited about their ESG campaign. They make these broad statements about we are, carbon neutral, or we will be carbon neutral in 5 years. And when there's no way they can get there, they have no plan, they can't make it happen. They're making themselves vulnerable to claims. And those can come from class action consumers saying, hey, we used your allegedly sustainable K-cups. There's a big case against Keurig that got a lot of press where, they claimed the cups were recyclable, but the evidence was over 90% never got recycled. They were very difficult to recycle. And they ended up, having liability there for making those exaggerated claims about recyclability. Other companies, I think, really put themselves at risk with broad statements that we're a green company, we're earth friendly, we're consumer friendly. Those kind of broad statements are often hard to back up and can create real vulnerability from either direct litigation or regulatory actions from the Federal Trade Commission. which is charged with regulating deceptive advertising. One of their current priorities is greenwashing, which we can talk a little more about, but they've really indicated that they're updating their green guides in terms of what you can and cannot say. And they are really, the signaling coming out of Washington is they're going to be much more aggressive at policing unsupported claims around sustainability, recyclability, kind of green marketing, carbon zero claims. That's really, that's a priority. And I think, the last thing you want are regulators knocking at your door saying, where's your proof to support this claim that your marketing firm came up with, that you're making the earth a greener place. That's a difficult situation. And so you do need to think carefully before you make those claims. And, and my advice is general, we can dive into specifics, but have claims that are specific and defensible. If you're saying, we're going to increase, how much plastic we recycle by 20%, you've got a plan to do it and some way to actually measure it in pounds of plastic or something else, that's fine. If you've got a good system to measure carbon emissions, and that's not easy to do, but if you've done it and you're going to commit to a reduction or going to publish a reduction, that's fine. I think if you have data to support the claims, it's good. It's more these big aspirational broad statements that really put you at risk. Obviously, if you make a specific claim, you've got to have the backup for it, and you need to have that documented and maintained in a way that I, as your litigator, or the FTC as a government, can come and say, hey, show me what supports the claim. But I think if you've done that homework and have it documented, you can make the claims. There can be a lot of value in making the claims, but you have to go through that rigorous process at the front end. You can't be trying to do it after the fact.
And I would add to that, have systems in place to be transparent, whether you've reached your targets exactly or not, right? Using those same measurements, you have to be honest, even if you haven't reached the targets you set out to reach. So we've touched a little bit on greenwashing, but tell me, what other trends are you seeing in the ESG space, in your practice, with your clients, et cetera?
So I see several. There's been a lot of talk at the client level now on, and it's really the S of ESG. And I think you and I, there's been a lot of focus on environmental, but the social goals. And I think the Supreme Court decision in SFFA versus Harvard and UNC, that's the one that outlawed affirmative action, has had dramatic impact on clients and on law firms too. I'm happy to talk to you about the impact where, just as a reminder to our audience, the Supreme Court in pretty broad language said all affirmative action programs are impermissible discrimination under the Constitution. And that has triggered a series of letters, primarily from conservative groups and some attorney generals from conservative states, sending out letters to various companies saying, you've advertised your diversity program, which we think is a form of affirmative action. And if you don't stop those programs, we are going to sue you. Some folks have been sued. I think professional services firms, including law firms and consultants, have been in particular targeted by some of these efforts. So there's a lawsuit now challenging a scholarship program where the scholarship was specified that it had to go to a minority candidate, and there's language in there about what that means, but that's being challenged essentially as a quota because it's arguably not opened to a non-diverse white male 20-year-old who is cisgendered, doesn't fit into any other category. There's a real argument that scholarship's not available, and does that violate the Supreme Court decision in SFFA? I think there's a lot of questions to be answered about what programs are and are not valid, but I think that what I see as a top trend for 2024 is, folks are reevaluating their programs. I think there certainly remains a commitment to diversity in most of these companies, but there's concern about the actual structure to make sure that it's not going to run afoul of the Supreme Court case, that it is not structured, which is really more of a, it wasn't, now the Supreme Court case wasn't a quota set, but it was, each of those systems gave specific weight to diversity. The Supreme Court said you can't do that. You can look at an individual's background, which may be, and the challenges that they faced, and have programs that take that type of thing into account, but it's more specific. And again, those programs were specific scoring for certain racial minorities that the Supreme Court said you can't do that. So I think that is on the social matrix, a pretty dramatic shift. And I think, in 2020, we saw after George Floyd, this huge focus on very broad and progressive and, focused efforts on things around DEI and new diversity directors being hired, broad goals and programs being adopted. And I think now there is, I would say not necessarily a pullback from the commitment, but a reanalyzing how the programs are being implemented. And in connection with that, and maybe a second trend is really the politicization of a lot of the ESG issues. But for example, in a lot of circles here, and I don't know if this is more of a phenomenon in the South or Mid-Atlantic, but even the term DEI has become a much more divisive term. I'm in North Carolina. We have a very conservative legislature. They passed, a statute saying they would withhold funding from any state-funded organization that adopted DEI initiatives. So it really became kind of this taboo witch hunt thing of, well, if you're calling it DEI, we don't think that's an appropriate use of state dollars, and we're gonna get rid of that. And so the language is changing, even if there's still that commitment to diversity. Is it DEI? Is it some other language that's going to emerge around, promoting a different collection of groups or reflecting the community? I think that's in flux. I've seen some, because of the politicization, and I know you're familiar with some of this at the state level, there's been anti-ESG legislation either introduced, in some cases adopted, such that ESG itself, that terminology, I think, is under attack in a way that we haven't really seen before. And I don't see that changing in 2024. And I don't know if we are going to end up shifting our language, to talk more about some of the components like climate change and business risks associated with climate change, as opposed to the ESG label. I'll say, from my perspective, I think it's unfortunate because you've taken, a very important area and now turned it into where the first instinct is this is a political Democrat-Republican question, when many of these issues in my mind are not so clearly defined. But that's another trend that I see. I think that we're going to see, and it's an election year, so we're going to see more talk of the presidential candidates, and in particular, I think Republican candidates using the ESG and DEI as a, symbol of the liberalism they oppose. And so I think we're going to see more polarization around some of the terminology being used.
Yep. And I'm absolutely seeing all of what you just discussed in the ESG space. I just read something this morning where more businesses are starting to refer to it just as responsible business practices. And yes, it covers everything that ESG framework historically has covered, but it's not using the words ESG for just that reason. It's easy to lash out at ESG. It's pretty hard to fight against responsible business practices, right? Because it's the
exactly.
Word. So
I think you're so right. It's like many things. It's a labeling game, and and ESG has gone by different labels before, and it'll go by other labels going forward. I'm with you. I don't think we can't get away from the idea of corporate responsibility and stakeholder accountability and other things. And no one, I think we have to do something about the climate change situation is only going to accelerate. These issues aren't going away. And I think the answer is to keep talking about them. And if we need to use less polarizing labeling, we can do that, but we still have to talk about how we're going to address these issues.
And continue progress, and as you were describing on the DE&I space, sort of reshape the program or revisit it, make sure that you're achieving the goals you want to without violating any of the constraints that have put in place, but don't stop making progress. And it's the same thing with ESG. Programs have to continue. I don't care what you call it necessarily, but progress has to continue. So speaking of regulations, do you think the SEC is actually going to issue their climate disclosure regs this year, carbon disclosure regs? And if so, what impact do you think that's going to have?
So it's a tough crystal ball question. I mean, there's been so many comments and it's been so politicized. My guess is yes, though. Here's why. It's an election year. And I think for the current administration, there are two factors that weigh into it. One is I do think it is something that they have committed to their base, and it's been a priority for President Biden. And I think he wants to have something come out around carbon. And so I think it's likely to happen, both because I think it may be viewed as a political stake in the ground. And I think there may be some fear, who knows what the results of the election are, but that if it doesn't happen now and gets postponed, and there's a change in administration, it'll never happen. So my guess is something will come out. What I'm less clear on is how much it tracks the original guidance. In other words, there's a lot of commentary, and the political landscape's definitely shifted a lot from when the guidelines were originally proposed. So we may see some watering down. I don't like to use that language, but I think the reality will be either longer timeframes for implementation or some reduction in some of the requirements to kind of modify and take some of the wind out of the people that are convinced that this will destroy American industry. So I think they'll come out with something, but it may be modified to address some of the criticisms. But I think that the idea of having the SEC come out with something is important politically. And so my guess is it will happen.
I'm predicting it will clearly be less stringent than the California rules that have recently been passed. What is your perception of how those are going to go down, and how are your clients reacting?
I think our clients are concerned about it, and still many of them in the figuring it out stage, right? Trying to understand what these are really going to mean. And I'll admit, I'm still figuring that out too. We've got some folks on our team that have worked directly on those. We've done a couple of client alerts on on the guidelines. I think it's going to be interesting. And in particular, I'm wondering kind of what will be the first test cases on those. When these guidelines come out, you often don't really know how things are going to play out or who's going to be targeted until you see some enforcement actions. And I'll be very interested, and we should see that in 2024 to actually see, who are they going after? Is it huge public companies? Is it California-based entities? I think the whole, and the connection to California piece is a challenge, right? Lots of businesses do some tangential business in California, but it's not a big piece of their business. So it's, becomes a question of how much are we going to abide? Is it going to be like the auto industry, where almost all car manufacturers now comply with the California standards, that they're kind of driving the rest of the country? There's certainly at a corporate level, I think, resistance to that notion that automatically we're just going to adopt the California approach. So I'm very interested. I wish but I don't have a great crystal ball on that.
Okay, so one more crystal ball question.
Yeah.
What do you think 2024 is going to hold for us with respect to ESG, both here in the US and globally?
Well, I'm very interested to see where we end up with standards. As you know, there's been a lot going on in Europe this past year. We have the sustainability disclosure requirements from the Financial Conduct Authority. The International Sustainability Standards Board, ISSB, issued their standards. I do think Europe has been leading the way, and the US has kind of been catching up. That, if I were to point to a big trend, when I look at that's true even in our firm, our law office. Our firm over there is more advanced than we are on a lot of. They've won the Sustainability Law Firm of the Year award and other stuff. We're playing some catch up on this side of the pond, and I think the European Union has kind of taken the advance there. I think we're going to see more effort to try to come up with more measurable standards here. Just every time I preach to companies about the importance of having something measurable that they can measure against, the question is, well, what are those standards? And as you know, right now we still got a whole collection of them. I'm not saying we're going to only have one standard in 2024. In fact, I don't think that'll be the case, but I'd like to see. I do think it'll be important to move towards a handful of kind of the broadly accepted standards, and I don't think we're there. So I would say that's one. I think the other big change is one I mentioned, but it only touched on, which is more private company concern. With Scope 3 and everything that's happening around Scope 3, private companies, the big public companies, the Exxons and the giant companies, they've had teams aware of climate change and ESG for a long time with full-time staff. It's not new, but we have some pretty big private companies that are
Mm.
not used to doing 10Ks, aren't really following SEC, aren't getting the letters,
Yep.
the black rock letters saying this is key, that are now getting compliance letters from the big companies saying, we started to measure our scope 3 emissions. Please tell us what you are. And I think that this may be the year that those companies really begin to say, oh, this has an impact. Certainly, if the SEC adopts it, I think there'll be a much more standardized push from public companies to do more reporting, and inevitably, that's going to, with Scope 3, it's going to get more private companies on board. So
And
that's my other prediction: is it'll be the year private companies actually begin to care. And again, it may be not broadly ESG; it may be more carbon focused,
right.
ESG around their reporting. But that will be when I've talked to private companies about it, it's very eye opening. They've assumed that it's not going to be an issue for them because they don't file public securities filings, and that's not
Yep.
the case.
And I think the same holds true for the California regs. That the greatest impact of the California regs, it seems to me, is going to be all the private companies that are going to be affected either directly or through Scope 3.
Yes.
And they've never even thought about this before. So if we talk again a year from now, what will we be talking about in the ESG space?
Yeah, there's lots to talk about. Well, I do think, well, we'll be talking about the outcome of the election. I
Mhm.
think that the number one, significant event to me is the November presidential election. If Trump gets reelected, and I expect him to be the nominee, if he gets reelected, I think it's going to be a dramatic shift, right? He's going
Mhm.
to try to undo everything that the Biden administration has
Yeah.
done
Mhm.
in the ESG arena, and I think reacting to that will probably be our number one topic. What does
Yeah.
this mean? And then you're going to get into much more, even with California, I could see federal efforts to essentially try to overrule or undermine, the California regulations. There's already been discussion about that at a congressional level, but given the current political makeup, I don't see that happening. But if it changes after November, I think that'd be our number one discussion. We'll
Yeah.
probably still be talking about standards and
Yes.
how
Yes.
to
We will
measure
be.
it. And so I think a year from now that will still be there. The biggest wild card for me is probably the social component, whether we're still
Mhm.
using the ESG terminology or not. This, that's such a big umbrella, but where will companies stand on some of these policies around, what we're now calling DEI? Will there be new terminology? What will be the kind of the cultural zeitgeist around those policies? I think that this will be a year to me of evolution in that area, because I think we'll see some new terminology and new perspectives. We've got this, but thanks to 2020, a lot of companies have not only established programs around diversity and inclusion, but they've hired diversity directors and officers. So whatever the language is, those people are going to have jobs and going to be making an impact. And so I think seeing how that plays out in a year that's politicized will be an interesting one to follow.
So here's my favorite question to close with. I love to ask people, especially here in the US where it's quite politicized right now, what gives you hope? How do we keep doing this work day in and day out?
I am hopeful that there's still a lot of dialogue. I try to take the reason we're having politicization and controversy is big decisions are controversial and change takes effort. So
Mm.
it's not easy to change the way we're thinking about big issues. And climate change is certainly in my mind, the biggest issue we're facing as a whole global society.
Yeah.
So there's going to be fighting and resistance and objection to that. That's part of the process. I believe, though, we have we have a lot of smart minds. When you get into the calmer circles, when you read some of the thoughtful articles, there
Mhm.
people aren't really debating whether climate change is real. People are just talking about what the best approach is to fix it. I do think there is a will to recognize it, and I do think there's a bipartisan commitment. I don't think it's every Republican is opposed to to addressing these issues. There are simply disagreements on how to do it. So I think, and unfortunately, as the war, as our country at least continues to warm up, we just set another, world record for the hottest day. 2024 is almost certainly going to be another hottest day ever. I think even people that aren't sure what to do will begin to say we've got to take action. And I do think there's a much higher level of corporate recognition that this is a
Mhm.
problem. I think, even if we don't have the formal SEC requirement, when you read statements and talk to company executives, they're aware that climate change is real and coming and is something that needs to be addressed. So that gives me hope. I think people are aware of the problem, and we have a lot of creative people working to fix it. So I think we'll get beyond some of the squabbling to a more solution oriented position.
I agree with you, and I so hope we're right. So, with that, I want to thank you so much for your time in this very insightful and thoughtful conversation. And I will have you back a year from now and we'll revisit some of these issues.
I'd
Thank you very
enjoy it,
much.
Pam. Thank you.
Okay, take
Enjoyed it a
care.
lot. Thanks. Bye bye.